It was said that in the final days of the month, when the nights grew colder and the fog thicker, the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. The townspeople had long since stopped questioning it, their fear and superstition woven into the fabric of their everyday lives. For Sarah Whitaker, however, November was different. She had recently returned to Coldridge after years of studying in the city. The lure of the town's eerie charm had always been strong, but she had never been prepared for the way it had changed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something old, something buried deep in the earth beneath Coldridge. Sarah's grandfather, Ezekiel Whitaker, had been the town's most respected historian before his passing. He was a quiet man, not prone to superstition, but even he had been wary of the old cemetery on the edge of town. He had once told her that Coldridge was built upon land cursed by its own history. The town had been founded during the early 1800s by a group of settlers fleeing the madness of the Revolutionary War, but some of them had brought with them a dark secret, a pact made with an ancient force that lingered in the fog. Ezekiel's studies had revealed that the settlers, desperate to survive the harsh winters, had resorted to dark rituals to keep their crops fertile and the land from freezing over. What they did in those woods no one could say for sure, but the land had been forever marked by their actions. And the cemetery, well, that was where things took a darker turn. Legend told that in the final days of November, when the fog would settle in, the spirits of those who had died under unnatural circumstances, the ones who had fallen to fever, starvation, or worse, would rise. They were not the peaceful souls of the dead, but something much more malevolent, hungry, vengeful spirits who sought to drag the living into their graves. Sarah's grandfather had warned her that the town was more than just a quiet retreat. It was a place where the veil between the worlds was thinnest during the cold months. The people of Coldridge, for all their suspicion of the cemetery, never spoke too loudly about the things they knew. They simply stayed indoors when the fog rolled in, not daring to tempt fate. It was on the evening of November 28th, the night before the fog was due to settle over the town, that Sarah found herself walking home from the library. The chill in the air was biting, and a thick fog had already begun to roll in, a soft, wet mist that obscured the streetlights and muffled the sounds of the town. As Sarah walked, her footsteps echoing off the cobblestones, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the town's history pressing down on her. Her grandfather's warnings echoed in her mind, but she shook them off. She was an adult now. An educated woman with a rational mind. She wasn't going to let silly superstition rule her life. But something was wrong. The fog had never been this thick before, and the temperature had dropped so suddenly it felt unnatural. As she passed the edge of the cemetery, her curiosity got the better of her. The gates, usually locked and secured, were wide open. The iron bars, once rusted and corroded, now gleamed in the mist like the mouth of a cavern. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She glanced around, half expecting someone to call out to her. But the street was empty. The sound of her breathing was the only noise breaking the suffocating silence. Then, against her better judgment, she stepped through the gates. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the fog swirling around her like a living thing. The gravestones, most of them weathered by time, were half hidden in the mist, their inscriptions barely legible. She walked deeper into the grounds, the air growing colder with each step, until she reached a clearing near the center. Here, the fog thickened to the point where she could barely see her hands in front of her. It was as if the fog had become a barrier, trapping her in the heart of the cemetery. That's when she saw them. Figures cloaked in shadow drifting between the gravestones. Their movements were unnatural, as though they were being pulled by invisible strings. At first, Sarah thought they were other people, perhaps lost travelers or town residents who had wandered in. But as she stared, she realized that these figures weren't quite right. Their bodies were translucent, flickering in and out of existence, and their faces were pale, twisted with hunger and despair. Her heart began to race. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to leave, but when she did, the fog shifted, and the path she had come down was gone. In its place, a dense, impenetrable wall of mist closed in around her. Panic set in. "Sarah," a voice whispered, low and guttural, as though it came from deep beneath the earth itself. She spun around, but the cemetery was empty again. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to calm herself. "It's just the fog," she told herself. "It's all in my head." But then the whispers began again, louder this time, and they seemed to be coming from everywhere. "November is when they return." The voices repeated over and over, each word sending a chill down her spine. In the distance, she saw them again, those dark figures slowly advancing. This time she could hear the faint rustling of their movement, like dry leaves being stirred by an unseen wind. They were closing in. Frantic, Sarah tried to run, but her feet felt heavy, as if the earth itself was pulling her down. She stumbled, her hand reaching out to steady herself, but the fog pressed against her, thick and oppressive, until she was surrounded. It was as if she had become part of the mist itself. She heard a sound, soft at first, then louder. The creak of old wood, the rattle of chains, and then a low growl rising from the earth beneath her. The ground trembled, and from the graves around her, skeletal hands began to claw their way out of the soil, dragging themselves toward her. She screamed, but no sound came out. The fog thickened, and in the distance, she heard the faintest murmur. "November is when they return." When the fog finally lifted the next morning, the cemetery was as silent as ever, and Sarah Whitaker was gone. Days passed, and the townspeople whispered of her disappearance. The older generations who remembered the old stories simply nodded grimly. They knew the truth. The fog wasn't just a weather pattern. It was a gateway, and those who ventured too close during the final days of November were never seen again. And so, each year as the fog began to rise, the people of Coldridge would retreat indoors, locking their doors and drawing their curtains tight. They knew that, come November, the dead would rise once more, and that the living were not safe. Sarah Whitaker was just the latest to vanish into the mist, and, just like the others before her, she would never be found. In the small, isolated farming town of Thornefield, the harvest was always a time of celebration, until the year the fog rolled in early. November had always been a quiet month, a time of transition before the long winter. The crops were gathered, the animals tended to, and the villagers prepared for the cold. But something sinister was lurking in the air that year, something no one could have expected. A storm had come through the night before, leaving behind a thick fog that clung to the fields and rolled through the streets like a living thing. The villagers noticed it immediately. It wasn't normal. The fog felt heavier than usual, thicker, like it had a mind of its own. But it wasn't until the next morning that they realized something was wrong. Maggie Hart, a young woman who lived on the outskirts of town, was the first to notice the strange events. The previous night, she had seen a shadowy figure in the fog near her farm, standing motionless among the rows of corn. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Farmers were often up early, especially in the final days of harvest. But when she woke up and went outside, the scene was unsettling. The cornfield was unnaturally quiet. There were no birds, no rustling of the wind, just the eerie hum of the fog. As Maggie walked toward the field, she noticed something strange. Half of the corn had been harvested, but the other half was untouched. The stalks were bent in a way that suggested someone had been working, but there were no footprints in the soil, just rows and rows of crops that seemed to grow unnaturally tall, stretching up like twisted fingers. Her heart began to race and she turned to head back to the house, but then she saw something that made her blood run cold. At the far end of the field, a shape moved in the mist, a tall figure draped in tattered, weathered clothes. It stood unmoving, facing her. The longer she stared, the more unnatural it became. The figure seemed almost translucent, as if it were partially a part of the fog itself. The edges of its form flickered in and out of existence. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure began to walk toward her, its steps slow and deliberate, like it was walking through water. But the closer it got, the more Maggie felt a chill spreading through her, like an invisible force was creeping under her skin. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt frozen in place. Before she could make a move, the figure stopped. It tilted its head almost as though it was studying her, its hollow eyes piercing through the mist. And then it spoke in a voice that was like the wind itself, harsh and dry. "November is when we return." A gust of cold wind hit her in the face, and when she blinked, the figure was gone. The fog had thickened, swallowing it whole. Terrified, Maggie stumbled back to her house, locking every door and window behind her. Her mind raced. What had she seen? And why had it spoken of returning? That evening, the fog continued to linger, wrapping itself around the town like a heavy cloak. It wasn't long before others began to notice strange things happening. The town's old mill, abandoned for years, had suddenly come to life, the sound of grinding gears and a faint glow coming from its windows. A neighbor's dog had disappeared, and strange, deep footprints had appeared in the muddy ground around town, footprints that didn't belong to any animal, but to something far larger. The next day, more people began to disappear. A farmer who had been working in his field, a couple who had been walking home from the church, one by one. The villagers were vanishing, and no one could explain why. The fog seemed to have a life of its own, creeping into homes, wrapping around the buildings and taking people without a sound. Maggie, unable to shake the haunting image of the figure, decided to visit the town's old cemetery, which lay on the outskirts of town near the woods. Her grandfather had told her stories of the place when she was a child, stories about how the dead had once been buried with strange rituals, and how, in the darkest days of November, they would rise from their graves to claim what was owed to them. As Maggie walked through the overgrown cemetery, she felt the temperature drop even further. The fog seemed to grow thicker, suffocating her, and the air tasted metallic. She reached the center of the cemetery where the oldest graves stood, their stones cracked and weathered by time. There, at the center of it all, was a single massive stone altar, covered in symbols she couldn't understand. Just as she approached it, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the fog parted momentarily to reveal the figures, dozens of them, emerging from the graves. Their bodies were skeletal and decayed, wrapped in tattered shrouds, their hollow eyes staring at her with an otherworldly hunger. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figures moved toward her, and as they did, they spoke in a unified voice that echoed through her mind. "November is the time of the harvest, and we have come to claim." The earth beneath her cracked open, and Maggie felt herself being pulled downward, her body sinking into the cold, damp soil. The fog enveloped her completely, and in the last moments of her consciousness, she saw the faces of the lost townspeople, their hollow eyes staring back at her. The next day, when the fog finally lifted, Thornefield was silent. The streets were empty, the houses abandoned. The harvest had been gathered, but at a terrible cost. The villagers had disappeared, their bodies claimed by the fog. The townspeople of Thornefield never returned. And each year, as November arrived and the fog began to roll in, those who dared to venture near the abandoned town would hear the whispering voices in the wind. "November is when we return.